the purpose of school, in my view, should not be to have a hierarchy, a classification system of who is more globally, generally intelligent versus not. What you can glean from an IQ test that is valuable is looking at a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So all of us have a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Even those with a very high global IQ score, when you look at more detailed level, you'll see, oh, well, they're much better at maybe vocabulary than they are at visual spatial. And let's look at see what their pattern of strengths and weaknesses are and really help target their strengths, no matter who they are or regardless of their global total IQ score. So I think I like to see gifted education movement moving more towards understanding the holistic aspect of the person's intelligence, not just their cognitive ability, but also their personal characteristics.
Well, why don't we get started?
Get started? Okay.
Yeah. There you go. So we start by doing vocal warm-ups. And no, totally. That's right. You're a singer.
I was a professional opera singer.
That's right. Well.
Time to say goodbye. Sorry, I saw Andrea Bocelli last night at the Hollywood Bowl. Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about that after. Okay. Why don't we start with we always like to get a good background of our guests, how they got to the point of where they are today. You know, obviously, you know, you're very accomplished and you're very knowledgeable about what you talk about. So I'm always curious about your journey, and I'm also curious because you've talked about it before, and I think it's a really interesting and inspiring story.
Thank you. So have we officially begun the interview?
Yeah.
It's not a warm-up, it's the real thing.
Yeah.
Well, as far back as I can remember, I was obsessed with individual differences. So what I mean by that, you know, I remember just even like at my earliest memory, just looking and observing people in the jungle gym, you know, and I know I should have been participating, but I always kind of felt like this observer and like, well, why is that person so effortlessly, you know, climbing that, and that kid keeps clunkily falling down, and that kid is over there in the corner, like not making eye contact with anyone. And that kid over there is bullying everyone. I was always so just obsessed with, like, you know, what makes us individuals and unique personality and talents, you know, what is talent and things like that. So I do recall those early memories. Also, I had a personal experience when I was young in the education system where I was asked to repeat third grade. They told my parents they thought it would be a good idea if I repeated third grade for a couple reasons. One, they said they thought I was too immature to go into fourth grade. By immature, they just didn't know what to make of me because I was very creative. Also had an auditory disability when I was very, very young because I had a lot of fluid in my ears. So I was essentially deaf the first couple years of my life.
Oh, wow.
And when I was able to have an operation to remove the fluid, it's not like I could hear immediately. So I was a little bit, it took me an extra couple milliseconds to process things in real time in the classroom.
Wow. There's actually a term for that, right?
Central auditory processing disorder.
So it's other people have it as well?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it's totally a thing. Yeah. It's still not as well understood as other disorders, but like autism and dyslexia or other learning disabilities, but it certainly is a real thing. Also, I had anxiety issues. All these things in retrospect, I now understand myself pretty well now at this point after 40 years of existence. But, I can understand why it might have been confusing to educators that didn't really have the tools or understanding of various things, various neurological differences. So I definitely retreated inward and became really introspective and trying to figure out, not only what was happening to me, but who are these other kids that were in the special education room with me? What was that like? And then
So you were in special education as well?
They put me in special education. It was called the resource room, where I had to take remedial classes and very confused because I found the classes so boring and I didn't understand why I wasn't allowed to be challenged. So it was very frustrating to me. So yeah, even as young as can be, based on my personal experiences and everything, I became fascinated with the psychology, and I didn't know there was a whole field that existed. I didn't know science from schmience, you know what I mean? I was kept in special education till 9th grade, actually.
Wow!
And a teacher took me aside after class, and it was a substitute special ed teacher who had never seen me before, and she saw something in me that no one else had bothered to take the time to look beyond the labels that I had on me. And she took me aside after class, and she just looked at me, and she's like, I see you. And I was like, I looked down to make sure my zipper was not down, or like I was like, what is she seeing? And she's like, no, I see you're like, like I think I see you. Like, why are you here? Like you're like obviously capable of more. And I was like, no one's ever asked me that question before in my 9 grades here. And in my mind, it quickly went from like, why am I here to like, yeah, why am I here? And I felt really empowered for the first time to see what I was capable of. I just had no idea what I was capable of, and it became more of just like a curiosity thing. And so I told my parents that night, I was like, I'm not reporting back to special ed. And they set up a big meeting with the school psychologist and everyone in the community. No one's ever broken out of special ed before in my school district. So they had nothing in the rule books for the student, saying, I'm out. Peace.
Right. I'm done.
I'm out.
I'm done.
Drop the mic, So they let me out on a trial basis is what they decided. And if I were to fail, they'd put me back in. And I was like, great vote of confidence there
right.
on their part. But I just tried everything to see what I was capable of. I wasn't college bound. And I realized, and I went from a CD remedial student basically overnight, like literally the next semester, starting to get straight A's in like honors classes. So
how? Just from like a confidence switch?
I don't fully comprehend what exactly happened there, but I think that it was a matter of like, where do I direct my cognitive energies? So I had, I'm just going to keep it very real with you. I had retreated so inward to myself that I tuned out of the school system, but I became a really famous computer hacker.
Wait, like seriously?
Yeah. In middle school, like a world-renowned computer hacker called the Wizard.
Oh my
I know.
Oh my
to this day, people might be surprised to know that the Wizard was a 13-year-old kid in special ed.
Oh my gosh.
But that's where I directed all my cognitive energies. So it was great to then like go from underground, like to be able, I can now finally have an opportunity to show whatever intelligence I have. And it was so exciting to me to get that opportunity. And I just almost overnight quit the hacking. And like put my all into school, and I loved learning, and I realized I loved learning. I realized I loved a lot of things I never had an opportunity to even know that I loved.
Wow. I mean, I don't know, but it sounds like it kind of was a confidence thing.
It must have been to a certain degree. Yeah. But also there was this kind of like a intense drive to prove to people that I could do something valuable. So I don't know if that's confidence, but it's something. It was a definite drive. I don't know how healthy that drive is.
That seems to be a reoccurring theme in a lot of talks that we have here, particularly with guests that come on to talk about success and motivation. Is a lot of them talk about like having some form of like chip on your shoulder a little bit, or this need to try and prove people wrong. So I think that's like an interesting pattern that I've seen so far.
Yeah, and I know this researcher at Penn who's doing this experimental work to show that if you in the laboratory manipulate that factor, so you give people like they say, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. It makes them more likely for them to want to then in a follow-up task to prove the experimenter that they can do it. So I think there might be some quirk of human nature there at play.
Yeah. And that would be a hard balance, I feel like, of how much of that to give people to motivate them, but not too much to just shut them down.
Yeah.
So that's actually really interesting. We'll have to talk about that after and maybe have that person on. But
yeah.
So you start going, you get out of your special ed courses and you jump into, I guess, just like regular courses?
Yeah, I jumped into regular courses. I signed up for like Latin honors class. I loved Latin.
I'm sorry, what is it?
Latin.
Aladdin? As in the movie?
No.
Oh.
Latin.
Latin. I was like, yeah, I love that movie
I jumped into Aladdin to the genie bot thing. That's awesome.
You're blue. You're wearing blue.
True.
So
that's true.
That's funny. So Latin, wow. Learning languages, getting straight A's.
I want to be very clear. I sucked in a lot of things too. So this is not a story of like, I mean, I was just it was cool to like figure out like what I was good and not good at, but like I jumped into musicals, and I was part of the community theater West Side Story, which I am not ashamed to admit that I dropped out of because I couldn't handle I couldn't take the dancing anymore. If I had to do one more, I was like, I'm out. And then they made me do it one more. And I said, well, I did say if you made me do it one more, I'm out. And so
they're like, that's kind of how this whole thing works.
yeah, I just couldn't handle it. There are things that, just like geometry didn't click as much as algebra did for me. I find I have more of like a concrete analytical mind than visual spatial. But nevertheless, I went from not college bound to college bound. I applied to Carnegie Mellon my senior year to the psychology program, and I put in my personal statement, which I still have saved, about how our standard metrics of achievement and potential are missing out on a lot of kids. I even saw it even in my own special ed class. So many of my friends were capable of things that were far greater because I got a chance to know them and I was friends with them. And I'm like, well, how come no one else is seeing what I'm seeing in you? And it was really heartbreaking for me to see so many people of my friends around me in special ed. We all had low expectations. I mean, that's the thing. They all had low expectations for us. But I really saw, and Carnegie Mellon came back to me and they said, basically like, good story, bro. Nice essay. But
no.
But your SAT scores aren't high enough to redefine intelligence. Can you? So that was interesting, ironic thing. So I looked at the departments at Carnegie Mellon that didn't look at SAT scores too highly, and I found the opera department, and I just went right in the following week after being rejected from the psychology program and sang my heart out, and they accepted me on a partial scholarship to Carnegie Mellon for my voice, without realizing that I had already been rejected, and I was a whole year at Carnegie Mellon of a full-fledged card-carrying voice opera major.
When did you start like singing? Because I imagine you didn't just go in there and audition.
That's correct. That's correct. So around junior year or so in high school, or even sophomore, like once I got out of special ed, I think it was a joke or something, like heard someone doing opera and I just was like, we're in the car with my parents and I was like, oh, whatever. And my mom's like, that's really good. And I was like, you mean I'm faking it really good? No, she's like, that's probably really good. And I went to the choir teacher there and asked her if I could join the choir. And she invited me, she's like, absolutely. And so I did do choir and I started taking voice lessons. And I also played in the orchestra, cello. My grandfather was a cellist with the Philadelphia Orchestra and taught me how to play cello. So I definitely like was learning music and stuff. So it wasn't totally random that I went into the opera.
But it got you in.
It got me in.
And I mean,
through the back door.
From an outsider's perspective, hearing this story, it almost seems like no surprise that you kind of do what you do now, which is look at how we measure intelligence, right? Because of your story. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but was that your inspiration? Because to me, it kind of seems like, well, yeah, yes. With a story like that, of course you would be interested. It was
definitely my inspiration. Yeah. I mean, I remember a moment when I was asking the school psychologist, the senior year in high school, if I was like, my senior year, can I be in gifted education before I leave high school? Because all my friends are in gifted ed, and I really want to do the cool things they do in that room. And the school psychologist looked at my IQ score, my testing evaluation from 4th grade, when I had these auditory issues and things, and used that score as a basis to deny me access. And it's just around that time, I just dawned on me, like, wow, like I need to change the system. Like I really need to at some point, like your achievement should be able to trump your potential. And if you're actually doing it, you shouldn't be it shouldn't matter like what you were doing in like 4th grade, like and that I had that insight in that moment, and I was like, I didn't know the whole field of I didn't know like there was a psychology of intelligence that existed. I only discovered that when I took a cognitive psychology course in sophomore year of college. But yeah. And
that's cognitive psychology. Is that right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
I've talked about this briefly on the show before, but I had kind of a similar upbringing too, somewhat, in that, like, as a child and a student, I was a very, very bright, involved, curious, well-behaved kid. I was a teacher's pet. I was always the one to raise my hand to participate. But my test, I would say probably about middle school to high school and beyond elementary school is pretty good. But when it came to my grades and tests, especially the standardized testing, the big tests, I really struggled. I had a really hard time, and it was very very frustrating because I was actually trying.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be like seen as someone with a lot of potential. And, as you clearly know, that's not how they always gauge potential.
Yeah. And it's a shame that you feel like you would have to get your value or, perception from a standardized test.
Yeah. So I think this is why your work has really resonated with me.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I would love to jump into your work. Well, actually, no, first, my goodness. There's more than just Carnegie Mellon. You went on to do even more.
Yeah, but that's the gist of my story.
But you know what? Our viewers actually really love hearing about our guest background. We actually, I think a couple of times
Really?
we skipped it and we got a bunch of comments and we're like, well, we didn't get their background. So
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I've told the story so much in the past 4 years.
you can give the summarized.
Well, sure. So the end of my freshman year, after enduring a year of the opera major, I went into the psychology department, and this was my plan all along, but I tried to make pretend that I was really cool about it. And I said, and the secretary was there on her lunch break, and I was just like, "Hey, do you think maybe I could be a minor in psychology?" It's called foot in the door technique. When you ask someone out on a date, you never tell them what you really want to do. You're like, "Hey, let's get coffee."
That's what all those guys.
Yeah. Hey, you want coffee? But anyway, it's like, "Hey, could I be a minor in psychology?" And she's like, "Yeah, sure." No one's ever been this excited to be a minor in psychology at Carnegie Mellon before. And I was so excited. She's like, "Just sign this piece of paper." And I was like, had this piece of paper in my hand, and as I was walking home, actually was skipping home in my tights because I had dance class earlier that day. But I remember thinking, wow, I need to tell people the mystery of life is find a way, to get to where you want, find a path where you can just show up, and then no one questions it. She didn't question whether I was smart enough to be there anymore because I was already there. I was afraid. I was so nervous she was going to ask to look at my SAT scores, blah, blah, blah. But I was already at Carnegie Mellon, so she assumed I was smart enough to be a psychology major. And not only that, but because I, in a almost a very cheeky, perverse sort of way, wanted to really prove how far I've come, I then declared a major in computer science from Carnegie Mellon, which is considered not many people, I don't tell this part of the story that often, but MIT and Carnegie Mellon are considered the top schools in the country for computer science.
And because you had already hacked all the world's computers.
Yeah, so I was really interested in computer. That's right. I was really interested in computer science as a kid, and I was like, wait a minute, is it possible for me actually to study computer science at Carnegie Mellon while I'm here? Pick that up as well, and so I graduated with a double major in human computer interaction, cognitive science, psychology, and then a minor in opera. But yeah.
And then you went on to...
Then, you're really interested in this story?
I think your story is fascinating.
Okay,
Someone who went from... You were held back, special ed, to all that you've done. It's absolutely inspiring.
Well, so, my senior year, by senior year, I was getting really good grades and everything, and I knew that I wanted to do a Ph.D. in human psychology and in cognitive psychology, and study human intelligence. And I applied to Harvard and Yale for grad school, and for Yale, there was this guy, Robert Sternberg, a psychologist that was studying redefining intelligence, and I was like, wow, I really want to work with him and redefine intelligence. So I had emailed him the summer before and was like, can I be your water boy, basically? Can I come over to Yale? and just like be your unpaid research assistant. And what do you think he said? Yeah, of course.
Sure.
Yeah. Excellent. I'm sure he was like, excellent, free labor. And I went there for a summer and just did everything, like I could possibly do. And he fought for me on the committee. And I got accepted into the Ph.D. program at Yale, which is the farthest thing from middle school Scott, would ever imagine. College wasn't even really on my mind. So that was crazy.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then you've clearly just kept studying ever since.
Yeah, ever since I've relentlessly been studying human intelligence and creativity.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into that, because I'm like I've said before, I think your work kind of speaks to me from personal experience. So therefore, I think it's going to speak to a lot of other people too. So you
we're doing good.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. But so you talk about, so much of your work revolves around intelligence and what it is, how we measure it. So I'd love to jump into that. When we're talking, I guess with your work, when you're talking about intelligence, I guess, what are you talking about there? How do you define intelligence?
So I knew that if I wanted to study, if I ever wanted to change the system, I would have to study the classics, so to speak. People wouldn't take me seriously unless I had my chops in.
You had to study the classics.
The classics, yeah. So the classics of human intelligence. I knew that if I ever wanted to change things, I would have to study IQ. And the classics being IQ. I wanted to understand the science of IQ, which is the most predominant measure of intelligence. I wanted to really get into it, and take all my biases and preconceptions out of the picture.
It's like, what do they say? You have to know the rules of the game before you can change it.
I love that. Yeah. I don't know. Who says that?
I have no idea. I've just said one of those sayings you just hear around.
I like it.
I feel I'm full of those.
So I want to say I went into this in the very beginning of it, with some preconceptions about multiple intelligences and there's no such thing, IQ is a terrible marker of intelligence, blah, blah, blah. And I want to say there was a bit of a twist ending to the story. So, based on my own personal experiences and just falling in love with the writings of Howard Gardner, multiple intelligence theory, and Robert Sternberg, I went into it with these preconceptions, but I went and I studied the science of hardcore traditional measurements of intelligence with Nicholas McIntosh, a famous British psychometrician at Cambridge University. So I took off 6 months of college at Carnegie Mellon. It didn't count for anything, but I said, you know what, I got to do this. And Nicholas McIntosh took me under his wing, and I studied, and I decided I was just going to keep all my preconceptions, keep them in America, and I went to England at Cambridge. And studied hardcore, the traditional view of intelligence. And I will say that my thinking about intelligence became much more nuanced from studying with Nicholas McIntosh and watching his course, his lectures at Cambridge. And I realized that there's a lot more to the story, that there was a more nuanced way that I could go and go beyond our traditional metrics of intelligence without ignoring the truth about intelligence as well. I decided that at that point that I would never choose political correctness over, the truth of intelligence, but I did in my heart feel as though, I felt as though there were a lot of kids that were being left out, and I wanted to still see if I could still drawing on the science, still figure out, can I quantitatively figure out how many students are being left out and falling between the cracks, and then what we can do about them. So my journey into this was through traditional markers of intelligence, and I realized that IQ is a really terrific predictor of lots of things. I didn't want to believe that. But my journey took me to so many places that I never would have expected. So, try to think of an analogy, when someone's been abused or have gone through something, and then they almost try to seek out friends with their victimizer. Anyway, that might be a horrible analogy, but I'm saying similarly, I feel like the IQ test kind of like abused me as a kid, but I wanted to be friends with the IQ test and the IQ test constructors. I wanted them to like me without even knowing my history. I kept my history secret till my book Ungifted. I didn't tell in graduate school, I didn't tell my advisor. I didn't tell Nicholas McIntosh. I did not tell him that I was in special education, that I didn't want them to look at me any differently. I wanted them to take me seriously as a scientist. And so I even so one of the things that I felt really cheeky about is I wrote a paper with a team of IQ test constructors of some of the major IQ tests, showing such a strong correlation between IQ testing and academic achievement. And it was in that moment that I was like, well, I'm above the system now. It's almost like I hacked my way to from the kid who the IQ test limited my opportunities to now here I am writing authoritative papers on IQ test, the value of IQ.
It had to feel good.
With IQ test constructors. And, it was quite, and published in the journal Intelligence. And then I won this Mensa Research Award. And Mensa's the group for top 1% IQ. And I won this award for the research I've been doing on intelligence from Mensa. And again, that felt like almost imposter syndrome a little bit. It was like, should I tell them that I would never actually, when I was a kid, I wouldn't have qualified for their organization, and here they are offering me an award. So, but I kept all of that a secret because I really wanted to study the traditional view of intelligence. And then it was only after that I started to get beyond it and started to study creativity.
So what, because, there's such an irony there.
So many ironies as I take a sip.
So what is that? We're probably getting into the heart of your work, but what were your takeaways from that? What does that mean? The fact that someone who tested with low on IQ tests was then being awarded by doing work on IQ.
I want to be clear about something, because I think my story has been some people have misrepresented my story. Mm-hmm. So I never scored low in an IQ test. So I want to be clear about that. I think it is true. The part of the story is I didn't score high enough on the IQ test to qualify me for gifted education. So that's when they looked at my test, when I was young. But I think that what the major problem was is that I had such strong anxiety, and I had really strong test anxiety. And
Same.
And there was there was such a mismatch between, I became obsessed with IQ tests even as a kid. So the school psychologist would test my, intelligence or my whatever IQ measures, which is a certain chunk of intelligence. And, and I was angry at myself. Why didn't I ace that? I should have aced that. I know that I'm smarter than that. I was so nervous. I would go home and take IQ tests on the internet and score sky high. And I was like, why can't I demonstrate this in this way? It felt like being in quicksand. I felt the same way on SAT. I would take the practice SATs, and I would score sky high, and then I would be put in this environment where I could see the clock going down 4 minutes.
And everyone else is around you, and you're like, they're finishing, they're already done.
I'm sweating.
They're going through it so fast, and yeah.
And I felt stuck. I felt really in quicksand. No matter, I knew deep within that, just last night I aced the practice exam. So until I could really get over my anxiety issues, I don't think, I was really capable of demonstrating what I was really capable of. Yeah.
Gotcha. So you think a lot of it has to do with just the environment, the tests, the anxiety.
Absolutely. And being told I was learning disabled, which I think the anxiety came as a result of that, being put in special education. What do you think is going to happen when you take a student and you put them in a special room and you signal to them every day that you have low expectations of their performance? And you signal that every day, and then you give them a test, and they're like, good luck. I mean, that's, what would you expect of these kids?
So, what do you think this means for how we do measure intelligence right now? I mean, I guess the question would be how do we actually measure it? Which, we're talking about standardized tests, these IQ tests. I mean, are there other ways, institutions, and we as society measure? And what do you think about that?
Well, there's a bifurcation between like the science, like intelligence researchers who study it and publish in journals, and educators, educational psychologists. And I would argue that I've been crossing both worlds, going back and forth. But there are times when I really want to take the hat completely off before I go to the other one and then put on that hat. Because sometimes some things that are relevant in the science of intelligence, like how to measure intelligence, don't have practical value for helping kids flourish. So,
can you give an example?
There's a whole science of intelligence that looks at the G factor, general intelligence. So, and there's these fierce debates in the field, like whether or not. So the phenomenon of general intelligence is simply this: like people who tend to do well in one item on an IQ test or one subtest tend to do well in the other items, suggesting there might be some sort of thing that pervades all of these kinds of items. Charles Spearman called it mental energy, but psychologists finding it's a number of cognitive processes, like working memory, for instance. We know that people who have a high working memory, are able to like keep lots of things in their mind at once and synthesize it, tend to be good at multiple IQ type items. So there are certain processes that are in common. General intelligence. So it's pretty much agreed and consensus among serious intelligence researchers, there is such a thing as this G factor, or this positive manifold, it's called. There are debates as to what causes it, or they're really nerdy. I mean, there are such nerdy debates in the field about it, whether or not it's a reflective variable, or basically is G a driving force, or is it an emergent factor. You can go to these conferences, whatever, get really nerdy about all this stuff. But why should an elementary school teacher give a shit?
Yeah.
Am I allowed to curse on your show?
Yeah, you can.
Why would an elementary school teacher who give a shit about the nerdy debates about the G factor? Like, how is that science of intelligence relevant to an educational psychologist that is administering an IQ test? How important is it to know a child's total IQ score to help target interventions for them in a school system? And I would argue, as a lot of educational psychologists are starting to argue, that that's not where the action is in our school system, is not understanding the global IQ score and then sorting people based on that. The purpose of school, in my view, should not be to have a hierarchy or classification system of who is more globally, generally intelligent versus not. What you can glean from an IQ test that is valuable is looking at a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So all of us have a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Even those with a very high global IQ score, when you look at more detailed level, you'll see, they're much better at maybe vocabulary than they are at visual spatial. And let's look at see what their pattern of strengths and weaknesses are, and really help target their strengths, no matter who they are, or regardless of their global total IQ score. So I think I like to see gifted education movement moving more towards understanding the holistic aspect of the person's intelligence, not just their cognitive ability, but also their personal characteristics. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
The difference between these two fields?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what you're saying is, as of right now, a lot of these institutions, schools are measuring quote unquote intelligence and potential.
But why?
by IQ or whatever it is, when there's so much more to us and our personalities than just this. And this is a lot of what your work is, right? Is looking at personality traits, how we think, how we create. And that's
especially creativity.
And especially, yes. And you talk a lot about creativity, which we'll talk about. But so what would you recommend to these institutions, these tests? Like, what would you change about it if you could? If they came to you and said, how can we get a better picture of each individual child's potential?
So in my book on Gifted, and that wasn't a sneaky way of just plugging the book, I promise.
Even if it was, I want people to buy yours.
Thank you. In my book on Gifted, I really wanted to have the nuance where I acknowledge that general intelligence exists. See, the thing that's so weird about me is like I'm equally fascinated with the nerdy science of intelligence stuff, and I can really get in those trenches and write those papers. But then I'm also equally interested in the applied sort of how we can help kids flourish stuff. And sometimes those worlds, it's almost like multiple personalities, within me, because so what I did in my book on Gifted is I acknowledged there is such a thing as general intelligence, and I talked about the science of general intelligence. But I said what really matters in school, I think, is personal intelligence. So I defined personal intelligence as the dynamic interplay of engagement and abilities in pursuit of personal goals. So I said what we need to really get the greatest potential out of students is not just understanding their G score or their IQ score, but seeing how engaged they are and how excited they are in particular fields and domains. See how, because they feed off each other. The more engaged you are in something, the more your skill level or your intelligence improves. The more your intelligence improves, the more, I saw it myself, right? The second that I took myself out and started to see what I was capable of in certain classes intellectually, my whole motivational system suddenly became alive in a way that never existed before.
You were a computer hacker, which means you clearly had to have had an interest in that, which probably fueled your skill in that.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. So, and then also personal goals are so important. Like, what are your dreams, desires? Like, when you take an IQ test session, the test administrator will never ask you, what's your goal? I'm imparting this goal into you to solve these boring abstract puzzles, although they're exciting to some people. but even for those who these puzzles are exciting for, there's still more they want to do in their lives, than just solve IQ test items the rest of their life. So, the IQ test instructor, should be really or the educational psychologist or the teacher, the parent, really to see what really is the student engaged in, and what are their own personal goals, and how can we help them get them there. So I've really focused my whole program from understanding the science of intelligence to understanding the science of self-actualization, and that's been my most recent focus.
Self-actualization, and self-actualization is a accumulation of what you just talked about, like personal goals, interests, things like that. Is that what that
being able
is?
To realize your highest goals? We all have our goal hierarchies. At the lowest level of a goal hierarchy, simple like reflexive habits like eat a chocolate. I have a goal now, automatic goal, eat the chocolate.
It's a good goal.
Yeah. See it. We've also throughout the course of our day we're all cybernetic systems. We're all goal-directed systems. So we have all sorts of competing goals within ourselves at various different levels of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So I'm talking about our most consciously evolved goals and values. What is my highest North Star? Maybe it's, get a graduate degree and change a field, or maybe it's start a nonprofit. Maybe it's start a brilliant YouTube channel called Exploring Minds. What is you can see how that's a higher level goal than maybe you have probably other goals. You probably have some goals you're ashamed of, like we all do. It's human, the question is, how self-actualization to me is the actualization of those highest order goals that we have for ourselves that make us realize the best version of ourselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what does that look like for, say, children? Would you ask them, like, what are your goals right now, or what are your interests? How would you voice that to children?
Yeah, you absolutely can. You can, Paul Torrance, one of my favorite creativity researchers, he initiated this longitudinal study. You want to know what were the biggest markers of creativity across the lifespan. He found that one of the biggest markers of lifelong creativity started with elementary school, and they still followed these kids up to like 50 years later.
Oh, wow.
Was the extent to which these kids fell in love with a future image of themselves. So the way of doing that in young children is to really help them and ask them to kind of like think of what is a future image of you, obviously it's not going to be as fully formed as it is when you're an adult, but you will be surprised some of these kids how like developed and evolved some of their goals are. We found my, thing, what do you want to be when you grow up, sort of thing. We found they kept making me do this in special ed, and my parents found the one that I filled out when I was 12, and it said, when I grow up, I want to be an academic Ph.D. psychologist.
It did. It did.
I
Really?
swear, I took a picture of it. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
You can put it in the show notes if I send it to you. But it's just, I didn't remember doing that, but my mom saves everything.
Yeah.
So
Like most moms.
yeah. So I almost like fell out of my chair when I saw that, clearly there was some seed of something within me that wanted actualization.
There must really be something to that, because we've had on former guests who work specifically in like success and motivation, but with adults. And that's something that they have emphasized. A couple of them actually have flat out said, write down your goals and write down I've never heard it said this way, but write down your future self. And they had their own that literally they handed it to me and I read it here on camera. And it was word for word what they are doing right now. And, I've never heard that applied to children before. So I think like there really must be something.
There's something
to
there.
That.
And Torrance found that was the best predictor of lifelong creativity, not just like achievement, but personal, like meaningful creativity. Even 50 years later, like the IQ test was no longer a predictor of lifelong creativity. Even his own tests of creativity, none of the tests were predictive. It was really that carried the kids through their whole lives.
Yeah.
And you find this over and over again in creative people like Yo-Yo Ma. At a very young age, he made contact with the cello and was like, "Oh, I want to play the cello." It's called Howard Gardner calls it a crystallizing moment. You can have it at any age. You're never too late, by the way. You don't just have to be a kid to have realized a crystallizing moment. I wrote an article for Psychology Today called "Confessions of a Late Bloomer," where I profiled. I actually wrote a supplement to that called "Better Late Than Never," where I profiled late bloomers, and I was so fascinated. Like this one actor, he was 60 and he never acted before, but he made it on Broadway, I think. And
wow.
He said, "You know what? The benefit of starting later and making contact with what you love later is that you weed out all the. I didn't have to go through all the awkward, like competing with all the young kids, like
all the hot young.
It's a small, group that he competes with now."
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So you just talked about creativity, and you write a lot about your findings on creativity. What do you think is there a correlation between like intelligence or measuring intelligence and creativity?
Yeah, so in certain fields, I co-authored a paper with Jordan Peterson.
What's that?
Have you heard of Jordan Peterson?
Yeah. What did you wrote a paper with him? Or?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
In where we showed when I was in grad school, he was a legendary creativity researcher. Never saw that trajectory.
I know.
I didn't see that coming. But in grad school, I knew him as he studied latent inhibition and creative achievement. And it was such an deep influence on my work on creativity and the biological mechanisms of creativity. Also, Colin DeYoung, who was a grad student of his, was my mentor in grad school. So he was just like, "Hey, should we add this co-author, my advisor, and Jordan?" And I was like, "Sure." But that paper in particular showed, to answer your question, we showed that IQ was a substantial predictor of creative achievement in scientific fields, but it zero correlated with artistic creative achievement.
Oh, wow.
The thing that was the best predictor of both scientific and artistic creative achievement was this field, this personality domain called openness to experience. But you could actually break down the different facets of openness to experience, and you found intellectual curiosity was a better predictor of the art of science, scientific creativity, whereas more like raw openness to experience, like how open are you to your experiential world and your emotions and aesthetics, beauty. was more correlated with artistic creative achievement. So we found that level of kind of nuance there. But we found overall, and I found that since that paper, we found, my colleagues and I, I've spent maybe 10 years studying this openness to experience trait, find over and over again is the best predictor of creativity that you can find. It outpredicts all the other personality traits. Some people may have this myth of like the neurotic creative, or have this myth of that you have to be like agreeable to be, like, turns out assholes are equally as creative. Neurotic people do not have an upper edge. Don't have an edge. I don't know. Upper edge. That's weird. I always like make up new things on the spot.
If you just
phrases.
Say it with conviction, I'll buy it probably.
It's all good. Really openness to experience was like a super duper predictor.
So what you're saying is there was a spectrum of creativity.
Absolutely. Yeah. We looked at creative achievement. Again, Jordan and Shelley, his student, Shelley Carson, did a great work in creating the creative achievement questionnaire, which I've used a lot in my research, which allows, I think it goes beyond this kind of like, maybe some more subjective versions of tests of creativity, because you can actually put quantifiable, like I've had this many publications in peer-reviewed journals, if it's a scientific domain, or if it's in the arts, I've been recognized for my accomplishments publicly, and then you can look at different levels of creative achievement. And we looked across 10 different domains, from dance, to humor, to scientific inventions, to cooking, we were able to differentiate between these different things. But IQ was irrelevant to artistic creativity. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting. Kind of frustrating.
Why is that frustrating?
Well, because if so many of us are measuring, say, intelligence, or in schools, they're, dictating a lot of things based off of these tests. Yeah. And not, say, creativity. Yeah. I think that's a little frustrating.
Oh, yeah, that is frustrating.
Yeah, which I think we both kind of experienced a little bit.
But you're not frustrated that, like, IQ should be more of a relevant factor in the arts. No.
Oh, no. I mean, what would that do?
Yeah, I know.
So when you're studying creativity, like when you talk about the creative mind, you talk about the creative mind. What do you mean by that?
You're asking really good questions.
Oh, thank you.
That's a good question. The creative mind is obviously not a monolithic thing. I think like the thing that tends to characterize most creators is that they have messy minds. Mm-hmm. I use that. I
loved that you said that, because I.
Do you feel like you have a messy mind?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there were other traits that we will talk about that it was the first time I had ever heard them worded this way that I was like, oh my God, yes. Like when you talk about the personality paradoxes, yes, and the positive and negative emotions. But I'll let you, finish first, and then we can
Wonderful.
Go into that.
Yeah. The messy minds, we've been publishing neurological evidence. Roger Beatty has really taken the charge on that, and I want to give him a lot of credit. He's leading the way in the neuroscience of creativity. And, we've been publishing papers showing that creative individuals are better able to traverse these different brain networks that in most people are segregated. So for most people, they either are very good at like focusing and concentration, or you're a daydreamer, flighty kind of person. But creative individuals are able to be very adaptive and flexible in toggling between these different brain networks. So sometimes they're really good at just letting anything enter their consciousness and kind of entertaining any possibility, even the most politically incorrect ideas. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes they're able to hone in more on a particular idea and explore it. So they're really quick at going back and forth between these different modalities. This research is also accompanying this research is an interest I have in the link between mental illness and creativity, because and this relates to the messy minds aspect, because highly creative individuals at certain states of their creative process their brain scans are indistinguishable from mental patients of schizophrenia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But that's why it's really important to view the whole the whole thing is a messy process that creative people go through. You have to have trust that they'll get there. Picasso often said, "I didn't know where I was going till I got there." I'm sure there were various stages along the way of what Picasso was doing where people were like, "That's insane."
Right.
But it's the big picture that's important with creativity, not the specific state or the particular moment. I do think creative individuals are better able to dance with madness, but or flirt with it, but are able to come back and have reality monitoring as well. That's what separates them from mental patients.
Right. Right. So the personality traits I was talking to before, these are some of the things that I just really got to me, where, you talk about the highly creative minds, having high, what you can probably phrase it better, the positive and negative emotions, that they're able to kind of jump between those more than others.
Yeah. It's sort of the greater openness to the complexity of their experience. Absolutely. I mean, Frank Barron was a seminal creativity researcher, and he brought together some of the biggest thinkers of the time. This is the 60s. Truman Capote was there, and he brought them to a renovated fraternity house at USC and had them spend a week there taking psychological tests. And he found, and personality tests as well. And he found that they scored sky high on every measure of mental illness that he gave them, the MMPI. And they simultaneously scored high on every measure of mental health that he gave them. So he was like, what do I do with this beast, this creature of humanity, this creative person who simultaneously, and he has a quote, the creative person is adamantly insane, yet the most sane human we have in our gene pool. Yeah. It's quite a paradox that you see. Yeah.
And you talk about the paradoxes a lot with creative minds.
Yes.
You gave that example of the rock stars, the rock bands that you had talked with, like when they're off stage.
Oh yeah, Jennifer Grimes did that research for her master's thesis, where she went backstage at Ozfest, behind the curtain, and some of these heavy metal, musicians that were just on stage like thrashing their guitars were sent to Jennifer. They're like, she'd be like, "Do you ever, would you describe yourself as a highly sensitive person?" And they'd be like, "Oh yes, I really can't stand lots of stimulation. This is like behind afterwards. I really just need to really have my own personal space and tranquility and downtime. When they could control it like they did on stage." That was beneficial to them, but they didn't like the unplanned sort of interruptions, They probably wouldn't enjoy too much going to concerts. They'd probably enjoy performing at the concerts. Michael Jackson, by the way, as well, would talk about how he was painfully shy as a person, but when he was on stage, he would transform into something. So that duality is something very common among performers.
Right. I think you talked about the journalist Deborah Ward and how she wrote about creativity being the pressure valve for, I think she was talking about the sensitivity of highly creative minds, and creativity being the pressure valve for creatives, like for all that they have in them. They get it all out in whatever their creative outlet is.
I view creativity as the ultimate integration of our whole self. I really do. I think that I teach a course at Columbia on the science of living well, and a big part of that course is helping my students embrace the dark side, and they love that. I mean, they love embracing their dark side, getting permission to do so. Yeah. These college students are so stressed out these days. The suicide rates are so high. There's just so much anxiety, and to be able to sit and integrate in a healthy way, as opposed to feeling the pressure to constantly be perfect or to like show this face of happiness. All these college students are all suffering, yet they all feel this pressure with each other to show how put together they are. To me, creativity is this thing that allows you to get out all of this stuff in a productive outlet for the world, and we shouldn't be inhibiting certain strong potentialities within us, because it'll come out some way, and if we're not controlled or conscious about it, it'll come out in destructive ways. One of my hero intellectual influences, Rollo May, who was a humanistic psychologist, and I consider myself a humanistic psychologist. He called it the daimonic. He said the daimonic is anything that has strong enough power within us to overtake the whole system, the whole person. He said the daimonic is not the demon. It can go either way. And our daimonic, when it's not well integrated, can lead to the Holocaust, but when healthfully integrated, can lead to our highest heights of creative potential in a positive way. So I really resonate with that.
Is it Jordan Peterson who talks about the importance of recognizing the good and evil in all of us, because we all have it? Because he says, if you can recognize the darkness that you have in you, then you can consciously not be that person. But it's the people who won't recognize that parts of themselves that you have to worry about. Maybe it's not him. I don't want to say
it's definitely him.
Okay.
Because he's a big Jungian. So Jung, Carl Jung. So he's and that's something Carl Jung would say as well. So he's but there's overlap in our philosophies. He talks about his fondness for the humanistic psychologist.
What exactly is humanistic psychology?
So I was just gonna say real quick, Carl Rogers. He's talked about his and I'm a huge fan of Carl Rogers as well, but I'm more a fan of Abraham Maslow. So humanistic psychology was very popular in like the 50s and for a short period of time in psychology. I'm trying to bring it back in the 50s and 60s, where a small group of psychologists felt as though the current paradigm of the time, like the psychoanalysis and behavioralism, was leaving out the higher potentialities of man, is what they would say. But now we say humans. Because that's but you read all the readings, it's all man. I'm working on a book right now where I'm like every single other word is the word man, and I'm not like changing it to be general. Yeah. But anyway, and really kind of like what is it to be a whole person? They're really interested in this idea of the whole person and self-actualization, and what does that really mean to bring all of our capacities together in full force to really be all that we could be, in life, and also realize our spiritual possibilities. They're very interested in as well, and ethical responsibilities. Like they're very big into responsibility and taking responsibility.
Which Jordan Peterson talks
he's
about.
he's a little bit obsessed with that. But humanistic psychologists were very interested in that as well, and you do like Irving Yalom I'm a big fan of his as well. So the humanistic psychologist then kind of morphed into the existential humanistic psychologist, like Irving. Have you heard of Irving Yalom?
I don't think so.
He really wrote the textbook on existential psychotherapy. But he has found that in his practice, like the more the patients accept parts of themselves that they've prior have shun away, that is a huge, you see huge growth in practice, as well as taking responsibility for your whole self, not just the sides of yourself you don't like. So I think that this humanistic perspective is deeply needed in the world today. And in fact, I would say it's different than positive psychology, even though I am partly a positive psychologist as well. I taught positive psychology at Penn. I worked with the founder of the field, Martin Seligman, at Penn, and ran something called the Imagination Institute with him. But even with all that said, I felt like even the field of positive psychology was missing some of these more human aspects, of humanity. So the humanistic psychologists were not so focused on happiness or even high performance. These days people are just constantly talking about happiness, high performance, like Tim Ferriss, right? He's like obsessed with high performance and greatness, he's obsessed. Like, everyone he talks to is like, how great are you? Let's figure out how great are you? But no disrespect to Tim Ferriss, I want to be on his podcast someday. But
well, oh my gosh, this would be a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, but I do have some criticism, legit criticisms of such an intense focus on greatness and status,
Yeah.
Humanistic psychologists were so interested in only two things, health and growth. That was their focus, like how can we have the healthiest manifestation of our basic needs, not shun away those needs, not to admit that like we don't, or not to say that like, oh, the need for self-esteem is so destructive, like we're just going to be these higher beings and just ignore that. Yeah, you see these people who run these sex cults, or like, that's in the news right now, this individual, or you see like people, these how many gurus have been enlightened, and have told their people, oh yes, I've risen above my need for esteem. Bullshit.
Right. Really?
You
sure about that?
You wouldn't have like abused all of your women if you didn't have they did not have a healthy integration. So I just love the humanistic psychologist emphasis on healthy integration of everything.
Well, so what does that mean? Healthy integration. So you say growth,
not leaving anything behind, but folding it into a higher level of something. So for instance, there's no reason to deny within us how much we enjoy when we get praised by others. We don't need to rise above it. We integrate it. So we find a job, or we find something, like, do you really want to tell me the Dalai Lama, and maybe this is controversial, do you really want to tell me the Dalai Lama never, like, doesn't enjoy the, like, he's never inside being like, oh, go on, I am the greatest, I don't know. Anyway, okay. Yeah. But I don't want to start imitating him, but well, no, but
that's interesting, because I mean, even chemically speaking,
we're human. If you're human,
because isn't that what the whole thing with dopamine is that it's a chemical reaction, and that's not
social reward.
Yeah, that's not something you can like suppress, really.
Nor why would you want to? I just feel like people are constantly, like, even like sexual desires, like people who maybe grow up in very like religious households and they repress it, they become the kinkiest people when they become adults. I'm serious. Like research shows that, like conservative, Christian, like they then grow like
the stereotype of the person who's like the most gay marriage ends up being,
they're being taught their whole childhood that it's wrong, and so they goes underground, so then they overcompensate. Look, I just think healthy integration is not being ashamed of any of your quirks or desires, and it doesn't mean that you approve of them all. I created the self-actualization test. You can take it at selfactualizationtest.com.
No, actually,
it's free. It's a free test.
We were
so I'm
literally
not trying to sell anything.
We were just talking the other day, like our team, of how we wanted to take. We're like, there's so many great like personality or assessment tests out there that we think would just be great for us to take and share with each other and know each other. And so that's actually good to know.
Good.
What is it called? It's
selfactualizationtest.com.
Okay. Great.
I went back to Maslow's writings, and I wanted to see which of his characteristics of self-actualizing people held up and stood the test of time, and I found 10 characteristics. And one of them was acceptance, and that included self-acceptance. Self-acceptance was correlated with other acceptance. That's an interesting toggle as well that I've noticed. Some of the people that are the most like, judgmental of others, like they're constantly like, oh my gosh, can you believe that person, likes to do that? They also are the most like disapproving of those things within themselves. So there's this interesting toggle there. But back to the Dalai Lama a second. So, he's human. I'm sure that his dopamine is still firing when he's like, people are praising him all the time, but he has a healthy integration of it, is my perception, where he's helping the world. He's trying to make the world a better place. These things need not be at odds with each other. I find that the most self-actualized people are those that have what's called dichotomy transcendence. So they are able to they're able to transcend the ordinary dichotomies and ways of thinking about things that most people, male, female, like good versus evil, there's so many of these things that like most people just constantly like nature, nurture. I mean, I can go on and on and on. Love, hate. And I just find the most self-actualized people are those that that have a much more mature stance on and realistic stance on both the human frailties as well as humans' highest potentialities.
Would you describe it also as like the people who seem just the most content?
Yeah. Comfortable with themselves.
Comfortable
as well.
with themselves.
Yeah. They're a holistic unit. Yeah, they're a harmonious, single, whole person. And so I think that is absolutely true. I've even like put items on tests like I am comfortable with myself, and I find that correlates so strongly with so many other integration variables. We actually want to publish that someday. But
Yeah. So you think that this, because I think that I think everyone knows that person, or maybe is that person that just seems so content, right? And everyone kind of, how are they like that? How can you be like that?
on the flip side, we all know the person who you can just they reek of the fact that they're having internal strife. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like everything is so conflicted.
Yes.
Like they so desperately want to get freaky over there. But they also like, no, but I'm not that kind of person, but you can tell that they're so.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
There's absolutely, there's a, I know exactly what again, I think we all know people like that, where there's just like, you can, the internal struggle is palpable to everyone around them.
Yes, they're not comfortable with themselves, and they're not comfortable with others either.
Yes,
they tend to be the most judgmental people. They tend to be the type of people that the slightest thing is like, oh, can you believe that they are into that?
Yeah. And so you think that the quality or whatever you would call it of self-actualization can explain the difference between the people who are content, let's say, and the people who have this, struggle within them.
Yes, but I want to add a little nuance to this because Maslow did, and he's a real influence on me. He argued that at the level of self-actualization, you have a different kind of discontent. So I wouldn't say it's as though they are content, but they have what he called the metapathologies. So it gets
me too.
Yeah. So we have, non-self-actualized people will have like, of course, no one's ever like fully self-actualized. So that's a dichotomy in itself to say non-self-actualized person.
It's almost like self-awareness, like having a little bit of a self-awareness. Yeah.
But those who strive towards self-actualization, I will say on a regular basis, tend to be, they're not necessarily happy, but their discontents are higher discontents. Like I'm discontent that like everyone else in this world is not transcending these dichotomies, that we have so much fighting and maybe tribalism in the world, or there's just this fundamental, there's still a discontent there, but it's a higher level of discontent, a discontent because they know and they can see a better world. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That their discontent is that they can't immediately help make everyone kind of see what they see.
As opposed to just more micro discontents of like,
I'm hungry.
Yes.
Like discontents of like, my girlfriend's jealous, or, I mean, things are all part of human nature as well, and part of human evolution. And I don't mean to like dismiss them as like, the concerns of the peons, like I'm not trying to say that at all. Oh my gosh, the peons are interested in relationships and all the romantic, stupid shit that people talk about in high school, But you do find, and if this sounds elitist, I guess it sounds elitist, but you do find people who are really striving towards self-actualization have higher level goals in their goal hierarchy, that they've reshuffled their priorities of what matters and what doesn't matter. And so a lot of these things that did matter in high school or whatever, or even, just don't even play a role in their consciousness anymore because they're so driven by these higher level goals. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So how can people...
Did I just alienate half of your audience?
No, okay. Not at all. How can people get there? Because it sounds like this could be a really important quality to self-betterment.
Yes.
It sounds like that anyway.
I think so. It's definitely a path to self-betterment. I mean, this is where my research is at these days, is building a real science of self-actualization that's not in some sort of what's the word people would use when it's like soft or woo-woo, I guess.
Yeah,
You know,
woo-woo.
I spent 6 months. I spent 5 months in San Diego writing, working on my next book, which I haven't revealed yet that I'm even working on a book. But
Well.
anyway, I spent 5 months in San Diego while I was working on this because I wanted, and then where I lived in particular was Encinitas because there was a self-actualization center, and I knew everyone was really spiritual and into self-actualization there, and I wanted to like live it while I was writing it. But what I saw a lot of there was a different kind of, I saw a very woo-woo form of self-actualization, like the chakras, all this stuff that it even firmed up my commitment more that there needs to be a sturdy foundation of self-actualization and so I've been really committed to like scientifically understanding what are the factors and characteristics that are most correlated with health and growth, the humanistic psychologists were talking about, and then what are the things that like we can do to increase our daily sense of awe and wonder in the world. That's also been a topic I've been studying with David Yaden at Penn. We created the Awe Experience Questionnaire, trying to scientifically capture the experience of awe and wonder and
You mean awe,
AWE, yeah. Maslow called it peak experiences, but peak experiences were what really fascinates me is how can more of us have that in our daily lives on a more regular basis, because it seems like self-actualized individuals or those who strive towards self-actualization regularly tend to have a higher frequency and depth and intensity of their peak experiences, and they're not diagnosed with bipolar.
Yeah, because I know that you study a lot on just well-being. Yeah. And it sounds like this fits in that conversation pretty strongly.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think that I want to, in a lot of ways, democratize spirituality, take it out, take this kind of feelings of oneness out of the church, and give people permission to have it in their daily lives. What you find is that people will go to church on Sunday and they'll feel great connectedness with all the members of their church, and then they'll leave church and they'll immediately get on Twitter and start yelling at someone with a different political view. I mean, it's like they forgot what they just learned in their church.
The cliche joke is like everyone in church, feeling great, and then going into the parking lot and yelling at each other in the parking lot.
But isn't that what we see today?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Can I ask if there's a predicted release date on that?
Oh, the book. Oh, boy, I haven't said this in public yet. So there is a date, but okay. I haven't admitted it yet.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Yeah. Gotcha. Well, Scott, gosh, we'll have to have you back because I feel like I could pick your brain about so many other things, but is there anything else that you would like to...
Time flies when you're in the Exploring Mind studio.
Yes.
Quote Scott Barry Kaufman. You put that on your blurb,
This is like exploring minds in what would the term be? Realization?
It's like a time warp in here.
Yeah.
But no, actualizing.
Because you really do explore minds.
I do. It's my day job. Yeah.
So
and you really do too, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I hope so.
You're great.
We hope so. It makes it easy when our guests are, we try our best to get on guests that are, we always say, passionate, but also just like actually really knowledgeable about what they're talking about, and it makes our jobs very, very easy because all we want to do is learn. And gain different perspectives. I mean, you clearly have a wonderful specific perspective, so it makes our job really easy when you have a lot to say. So
thank you.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you would like to touch on that we didn't while we have you this time around?
We really hit some good things that I enjoyed talking about. So thank you.
Good. Well, where can people find you? I mean, I know you have so much material out there, which is, I mean, you can kind of go down like this really great rabbit hole like I did with your stuff.
So really, I put it all at scottbarrykaufman.com. You can take all my self-actualized tests. We didn't even talk about the light versus dark triad.
How could we miss the white versus dark triad?
I just realized that. Maybe we
Well, we
could
can
save
if you have time.
Maybe we could save that for another
Okay.
time. Yeah.
It'll be an
I'll just
excuse
whet
to
the
get you back.
appetite of your
Yeah.
audience. But you can take the light versus dark triad test on my website. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Find out your balance of dark versus light force.
Oh, my God.
Within you. Yeah. Yeah.
That's all you can say.
You can take the test. Yeah.
All right. I mean, now I have to. But all right. Well, Scott, thank you so much, Dr. Scott. Thank you.
Thank you.
Inside joke from before we started shooting. Honestly, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
It's been a real honor, and I feel like it's all about integration, and I feel much more integrated after talking to you today.
Thank you. Me too. Me too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.